change and human security. And we're going to explore the value of women's leadership in response to these global challenges. We will have two short presentations, one from the Arab Water Council and one from UNDP on the overall issues of climate change and women in crisis. And then we have two exciting examples from countries in the region, from Iraq and from Sudan. And then I hope we will have an opportunity to open the floor to questions and answers. So please, can I ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can answer them on screen. First of all, we will have some introductory remarks from Dr. Khalida Bouzar, Regional Director of the Bureau of Arab States from UNDP. Over to you, Dr. Khalida. Thank you.
Good morning, Sabah al Khair. My intervention will be in English. Excellency Technical Deputy to the Minister of Health and Environment of Iraq, Mr. Jassim Al-Falahi, welcome to this event. Excellency Dr. Mahmoud Abu Zaid, President of the Arab Water Council, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. I'm very happy to be here today with you as part of the overall events that UNDP is convening to celebrate the International Women's Day. This year, it's an opportunity to celebrate achievement of women's leadership, but more importantly, to define what this leadership will look like in our context of today, meaning the post-COVID-19 world. As we build together a better, greener, and more equal, and hopefully a more inclusive future for us and for the future generations. Women in the Arab region are better off in many ways if you compare to several decades ago. There are more women in parliament, more women in jobs, and more women entrepreneurs. However, we can admit among ourselves that the progress is still very low and very slow. The region lags behind others in political representation, economic participation. Women, for example, account for only approximately 17% of parliamentary seats across the region. And just 1 in 5 women is taking part in the labor market. So the picture is not rosy. Women are also underrepresented in national committees for the COVID-19 response. And nevertheless, we know that women are leading at the community level, including in key areas like crisis response, climate change, preserving natural resources. And we have many examples across the region and across the globe. Therefore, the key is not only to support the increase of women leadership at national level, but I would like to say to acknowledge and to recognize and continue supporting the women's leadership that is already in place everywhere across the region, including in the most difficult context and at the community level. Today, as my colleague was just saying, we will discuss
كما قالت زميلتي اليوم سنناقش قيادة
especially women's leadership in climate change action in the context of conflict and displacement and disasters and fragility. The Arab region is heavily impacted by conflict and climate change, and it contains 14 of the world's 20 most water-stressed countries, and climate change is resulting in droughts, floods, dust storms, and intense heat waves, migration, displacement. You know, the region also hosts 26 million refugees and internally displaced persons. Conflict and social unrest, along with the effect of climate change on already scarce water resources, shifting agricultural seasons, and decreasing job opportunities, is undermining human development, human sustainable development and security, and unfortunately risks regressing in gender equality. The health and socioeconomic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated this risk as it has widened already existing inequalities. Yet, the relationship between climate change, human security, and displaced population, especially for women, is not sufficiently studied or explored. It is therefore critical to better understand how women in conflict and those who are already displaced are affected by this succession and multiple crises, which are very complex. We need to see how we, as the international community, can support them to meet their needs while tapping into these women's resources. Women are, after all, or I should say before all, the backbone of national and community resilience. Such support can help address the symptoms of conflict and climate insecurity, as well as gender inequality, and help in climate action and beyond. Today, in this meeting, we are aiming to explore these linkages through our informed panel and honorable participants, including our partners in the SDG Climate.
في مشروع مرفق المناخ لأهداف التنمية المستدامة.
Of multi-partnership approach in which UN agencies come together with Arab regional organizations such as the Arab Water Council, duly represented today by Your Excellency. We work jointly to advance climate security in the Arab states and tackle gender inequality, vulnerability to climate change impact, lack of job opportunities for women and youth, and water insecurity. This year, besides the COVID-19, of course, we are at a critical juncture as countries are convening and will be gathering in the climate COP26 in the fall to set yet an ambitious agenda for action on the climate emergency. Under our, as UNDP, the climate promise, which is led by our administrator himself, we are helping across the world 115 countries, enhancing their national NDC climate plans and increase ambition on the road of COP26. In the Arab region, we are supporting 7 countries, and gender is a key element of this process. In line with the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, UNDP helps countries take climate action seriously in a way that brings co-benefit not only for women's empowerment, but also for human security and other SDG priority. I must say that the region is lagging behind, as I said, on gender, but we are afraid that they might not be achieving all the SDGs in one go. I would conclude here as we have a very rich panel, and I would like to leave space for discussion. But before doing that, I would like to thank warmly the team who has put this together. And this was done thanks to the project financed by the government of Sweden through SIDA. So we thank them for that. And I'm grateful and looking forward to continue supporting results together at the crossroad of gender and resilience. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion. Over to you.
Civil engineer who has worked in the Arab Water Council for 10 years and who, among many other positions, is the main coordinator for the network of Arab women in water. Over to you, Heba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis.
الماء. مساء الخير جميعا. شكرا فرانسيس. أنا سعيدة جدا أن أكون هنا معكم.
Can you please bring up my presentation? Ziad. Well, until maybe they bring up my slides, I just wanted to say I'm not a gender expert myself, but recently the Arab Water Council have been working and have been doing significant efforts to mainstream gender in most of its regional activities and initiatives. We work now closely in collaboration with several international and regional institutions who have this mandate to learn from and to enhance our knowledge in order to advocate on the human face of climate change, and also to better understand very interesting topics that similar to the environmental migration which is currently at the forefront of political discussions and are attracting a lot of regional attention. So if you can go to my first slide, please. Next, please. Yes. No, the previous slide. Yes. Yes, okay. So as Dr. Khalida actually mentioned, our region is actually witnessing long-term climate change trends. And lots of scholars have been able to relate the climate change non-linear and indirect impacts to several sectors and several dimensions that led to increasing of vulnerabilities of societies. Additionally, with the number of extreme events that we have been witnessing in our region lately, and we have seen, for example, the situation in Sudan last year, this all revealed that we still have a long way to go to enhance our disaster risk management strategies and disaster risk reduction policies to save lives and also to protect our current development efforts. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So lately, the Arab Water Council, with several development agencies, have been advocating on the concept of climate security, being an emerging concept that is used to describe and understand the combined impacts of climate-related change on natural resources, ecosystems, socioeconomic development, and political stability. Climate change will continue to be a risk multiplier that will lead to multiple threats and can affect actually the national security of several locations and will mostly and immediately affect the vulnerable groups. And this necessitates integrated cross-sectoral mitigation and adaptation efforts. So in the next slide, looking at some facts and figures maybe, generally, in the next slide, please. Over the past 25 years, looking at some numbers, the female migrants have doubled from 5.6 million to around 11.6, according to the IOM and ESCWA report in 2017. Looking also at the percentage of women employed in agriculture, which actually exceeds 50% in countries like Egypt and could reach up to 60% in countries like Morocco, compared to the female share of agriculture holders, which is less than 6% in Egypt, 5% in Morocco, and less than 7% region-wide. Looking also at the changes in female employment in agriculture due to conflicts that really decreased in number of countries, and also the impact on their health due to the impact of conflicts and the impact of climate security on food security, really brings up the call to have a proper socioeconomic approach as a priority to address the needs of affected people, and especially women who are more vulnerable. Next, please. So although gender is not only talking about women's issues, but women are generally more vulnerable to climate effects because of several reasons, including the unequal access to resources and also some cultural norms that sometimes inhibit their ability to take action and to participate in the decision making. So according to the Gender Equality and Women Empowerment Group, led by UN Women, we can see that there are gender-based differences in the ways men and women are impacted by environmental degradations. There are an increase in the number of fatalities in women in cases of disasters, particularly in elder women and older women, and also women and girls with disabilities and pregnant women as well. There is also greater difficulties for them to move to the shelters and to have access to material and non-material recovery resources. In case also in the water scarcity situations, the collection of water, according to the UNICEF, is three quarters of the households. They actually task women and girls with the primary responsibility of collecting water. And in case of violence, in case of conflict, women are more subjected to violence, and also that's the same case in displacement. On the other side, I just want to say that they are always, women and girls are not always just victims, but they also play a very important role, and they are at the front line, first responders to disasters, helping their family and communities to survive. And they are also a main actor and agents of change, and definitely an accelerator to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So can we go to the next slide, please? So realizing all these facts, when the Arab Water Council, in collaboration with the UNDP, next slide, please, decided to do the first regional dialogue towards an integrated climate security framework for the Arab region, we had several task forces. One of them was to discuss climate security, social cohesion, and gender equality, where the group was requested to identify the main challenges that hinder the operationalization of climate security in practice, considering social cohesion and gender equality. I'm going to go quickly with you on some of these challenges. Can we go to the next slide, please? So for the political challenges, the main issues that were identified is lack of knowledge and awareness about the concepts of climate security in general, but also the lack of strong political will to integrate gender and social cohesion was also mentioned, taking into consideration that the Arab countries rank last worldwide in the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report, and the Arab women's economic participation was at 25% in 2015, which is the lowest globally. Weak representation of women in general, particularly in climate change, as scientists and as social scientists in decision making. Next. On the technical challenges, also lack of availability of data and research retaining link to gender, social cohesion, climate security was mentioned, and sometimes this is due to lack of consensus as well among researchers. Data on climate impacts and disasters in the Arab regions are still not sufficiently disaggregated, particularly for damage and losses databases. Also, lack of strong coordination mechanisms to form multidisciplinary teams, which are usually needed to do these types of multi-dimensional research, and that can only be done through joint efforts and unique collaborations. Next. The last thing in lack of institutional challenges was the lack of female leaders and scientists shaping the climate security agenda in general, and also the lack of women leadership in decision making. And this is not only about the numbers. The numbers is a good start to ensure the participation, but sometimes the participation amounted to women being passive recipients of information and couldn't really have an active role in the decision making. Also, lack of proper knowledge on how to integrate the mainstream gender in budgeting and implementation was one of the issues that were mentioned. Next. So talking about challenges, there are also some regional opportunities. I would like maybe to start with this gender equality and women empowerment group, which is a group that was initially done or initiated in coordination with the UN Disaster Risk Reduction, chaired by UN Women. And the main objective of this group is to promote gender responsive disaster prevention and risk reduction policies and plans. The group seek to link gender to DRR plans and to help the governments in formulating their national policies and promoting women participation in the decision making. Next. We have an upcoming event on the 23rd of March. We welcome you all to be participants of this event and also to participate in this group in case you would like to act as an agent for change. but it's going to be discussing climate change, gender, and also migration, and talking about policies and programmatic practices. Next. Another good initiative was the Regional Climate Security Network that was launched last year in 2020 during the regional dialogue. And the main objective of this network was to promote also research, knowledge, and information sharing, particularly for multidisciplinary research, as I mentioned. And it actually boosts gender equality in climate change responses and promote female leadership. And we would like also to invite all organizations and entities from government, non-governmental institutions, and particularly women and female leaders also to become part of this network and to help us in fulfilling the change that we would like to see in our region. My last slide will be regarding the Arab Geospatial Information Room. And the Arab Geospatial Information Room is a technical room that was launched in 2015 by the League of Arab States and currently hosted by the Arab Water Council. And the main objective of this room is to help in narrowing the gap in data and in information, and to help in collecting and analyzing studies and information to support the decision-making on environmental and socioeconomic aspects as well. So the room can also help in facilitating and collection of disaggregated data to support proper planning and mitigation efforts. The room actually builds on the current efforts done by the different NGOs, the CSOs, and the current data sets that are available in the Arab region, but helping to connect them together and also helping and doing more joint research activities that can really help us in better understanding such complex topics. I will stop here for the sake of time, and thank you very much for your invitation today, and back to you, Francis. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. Thank you for both telling us about all the challenges on climate security, social cohesion, and gender equality and how to bring them all together, but also pointing to some of the great movements that are going on to try and address this, especially around the data. It's very encouraging. I would remind everybody that this region has more women scientists than any other region, so there's no reason why we can't tackle some of this. Anyway, thank you. I would now like to hand over to my colleague Sujala Pant, who's the project manager of the regional SDG Climate Facility, and who will be presenting some of the findings from a recent study on climate change challenges and displaced and refugee women. Sujala, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis, for that introduction. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today some of the emerging findings from a regional analysis that we've undertaken. I'm just going to share my, my slide with you. Voilà. I hope you can see it. But before going into the regional analysis was focused on climate change impacts on a specific subset of women, because as you know, we cannot, women are a very heterogeneous group. And so the study really looks at the impacts of climate change on displaced women. So both women who are refugees as well as internally displaced people. But before going into the specifics of the study, I just wanted to remind us that we're working in a region that has huge levels of complexities, and Dr. Khalida mentioned them in her remarks, as did Heba just now. But it's challenges on multiple fronts and very sort of different types of factors that are converging to form really high levels of fragility and creating some incredibly difficult challenges with an already very arid region suffering from more severe droughts. The fastest rising temperatures in the world in a region that's already the most water stressed. Also, many conflict affected countries in the region, both active conflicts as well as protracted crises. which have created high levels of fragility, and bearing in mind that 67% of the forcibly displaced people worldwide are here in the region. You take all of that together, the region was unfortunately also one of the few ones where poverty actually doubled between 2015 and 2018, and this is likely to get worse because of the impacts of COVID-19. So really, this is it's a very challenging environment within which we're looking at the specific sort of struggles that displaced women are also having to face. Now, these threats are not new, and climate change doesn't just create them. It does, however, increase their intensity and frequency, and their impacts are amplified, which is why we often refer to this as a threat multiplier. And when climate change interacts with these types of pressures, whether they're on the socioeconomic front, social inequalities, poor governance, we often use the lens of climate security to understand these risks. And as with most types of risks, individuals and communities who are already marginalized or already vulnerable are likely to suffer the most. And that's why this regional analysis that I'm going to go into some level of detail on focuses on one specific part of this vulnerable group. This working paper was undertaken within the context of the regional project, the SDG Climate Facility project, and it attempted to assess the impacts of climate change on displaced women, as I mentioned. So really trying to unpack what this means, but also look at it from a sort of a future-oriented perspective and look at how climate-related solutions can become part of longer-term sustainable responses
من الاستجابات
of women. We also looked, because of the timing of the study, we also looked at the additional impacts that COVID-19 brought into this already a complicated situation. The methodology, it has been a desk-based analysis based on materials that were available and really focused on materials available and specific to the region. In addition to that, there were selected consultations with stakeholders in the humanitarian and development sectors as well, which gave us a very interesting sort of perspective. Now, in undertaking the analysis, the paper was framed around 3 issues: livelihoods, water scarcity, food security. Why? Because these are some of the sectors that are most affected by climate change. But importantly, they're also essential and critical to the well-being of women, including that of displaced women. So while there are other issues that are probably relevant to the discussion, the paper really kind of zoomed in on these 3 things. Now, if I can walk you through very quickly on some of the impacts on livelihoods, it's worth remembering that this region actually has one of the lowest rates of formal employment where women are formally employed. Within that limited space, agricultural related livelihood options is still the most significant source of employment. Interestingly, it is also one of the few sectors that are open to refugees and therefore is a main provider of jobs and income for them. On the flip side, agriculture is also highly affected by climate change due to quality of land, water shortages, which really then affects the opportunities that the sector provides in terms of livelihoods. And because women are usually employed in sort of very daily contractual arrangements, very informal arrangements, they're also the first ones to suffer from any shocks that are felt within the sector. So, this is definitely one of the areas where the impacts on displaced women is felt very acutely. Impact from water scarcity. As I mentioned, it's an issue for the whole region, but the situation's actually worsened for displaced women because firstly, camps are not able to provide the daily recommended minimum of water per person per day. And so there's one issue around quantity and access. The other is that Displaced communities in general are also perceived to be one of the causes for worsening water scarcity, which really ignores the fact that there are causes related to malgovernance, ineffective water management, infrastructure that's not up to par anymore, as well as the impacts of climate change, which makes the situation worse. But the lingering sort of perception really kind of maintains a kind of underlying social tension. And again, women are disproportionately affected by this because as in a general context, displaced women are also the ones who are usually the most responsible for water collection. So that multiple layer of effect, but as well as some of the perceived discrimination and prejudices are something that they have to deal with. Food security is the other angle that I would like to highlight here. This is one of the most food import dependent region. And in the context of displaced communities, it is worth noting that 50% of refugee households in Jordan face insecurity and as such resort to both decreasing the quantity of consumption as well as the quality of food. And in a survey that was undertaken in Azraq camp in Jordan, 37% of the responses mentioned that they were coping with food shortages by reducing their caloric intake, basically. And again, another point to note is that 1/3 of refugee households are female-headed, and again, a disproportionate numbers of women are thus suffering from losses in food consumption, which has huge rollover effects on health, and in the case of younger girls, health, growth and development. Excuse me. So this vicious cycle, I mean, if you look at these three things separately, but also together, it's really, there is a huge possibility and danger that it becomes a vicious cycle and can create a domino effect. Now, this is of course just a flavor that you will find a bit more detail in the working paper itself, but you know, where do we go from here if this is the situation where displaced women carry the burden of different crises? You know, how do you even identify which is the worst stressor? Is there a worse stressor? But sometimes, you know, opportunities can be found in crises, and you know, climate change and perhaps even COVID-19 are the wake-up calls that are needed to address some of the systemic and gendered dynamics in the context of climate change and displacement. So the paper highlighted a number of recommendations or areas for future work, including looking at SDG 13, for instance, as an entry point to address the disconnect between climate change related initiatives on the one hand and development efforts, and then humanitarian efforts, which are usually addressed quite in isolation. Climate change is not always seen as a priority in humanitarian operations. And so, you know, it's really about trying to understand how we can increase the possibilities of SDG 13 as an entry point to bridge this gap with some, you know, in looking at innovative water management solutions in a camp context or in the context of displaced communities. We didn't really look at energy in the paper, but clean and renewable energy as a way to both lessen the burden of care, but also increase employment opportunities could be some of these entry points. This goes hand in hand with the issue around bridging the humanitarian development divide. And as we look towards integrated solutions, one of the most important factors that we will have to take into account is the funding and financing channels that are used by actors in these different areas, because they're the humanitarian channel, the development and climate change funding mechanisms, financing options are very separate and not necessarily linked with each other. So the success of any integrated solution is really also going to have to look at integrated financing and funding in order to have the kind of impact necessary in a larger context of displacement, and specifically in the context of displaced women as well. In all of these situations, engaging and benefiting from women's knowledge and leadership is really needs to be at the center of these solutions. And it is really important to have displaced women bring their own experiences and voices to inform such initiatives. At the same time, solutions to improve natural resources management, like water, for instance, can really also have positive effects in strengthening the social cohesion that is often undermined because of a lot of stress on these very scarce resources. Ultimately, what we realized during the process of undertaking this analysis is that more research is needed. There has been quite a lot on women in climate change solutions, women's key role in climate change related initiatives, but the specifics of displaced women is something that's not so easy to find in terms of existing information and knowledge. So there's really room to do a lot more in this area, particularly in this region where this is a very harsh reality. Likewise, developing a framework to systematically integrate climate considerations that have a gender perspective and a gender angle may also be a very practical and concrete next step that those of us working in these situations can work towards. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry, this was very sort of fast because of the time constraints, but I hope it gives you a flavor. And we will be sharing the paper with you in the coming weeks. It's just going through some final edits and final rounds of getting it to a stage where we can share it with you. So thank you very much for your attention today.
Everybody to put their questions in the Q&A box so that we might be able to get to them. And our question has asked about whether there's any good examples in the region where women are taking leadership. So I think it's very interesting that we're now moving to, indeed, two very exciting examples, one from Iraq and one from Sudan. And first of all, we'd like to move to Iraq and to, if I may say, to the beating heart of the marshlands, an area that has suffered greatly over the last decades from misplaced government policy and indeed from climate change. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Jassim Al-Falahi, Deputy Technical Minister in the Iraqi Ministry of Health and Environment, and Zaina Ali Ahmed, Resident Representative of UNDP in Iraq, who will jointly make this presentation. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'll try to put on my video, but the internet is very unstable. Dr. Jassim, would you like me to go first? We have combined 10 minutes. دكتور بتحب تبدأ؟
Sorry, Dr. Zina, you are always the first.
شكرا شكرا. Thank you very much. Thanks. Colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to be able to present this exciting spotlight on climate change and human security on women's leadership in the Arab states. And I will be presenting very briefly on one very interesting, if I may, initiative of the country office that puts the spotlight on this nexus. I will not repeat a lot of the overall context. We all know how Iraq has suffered a lot from conflict, from deterioration of basic services. However, maybe we need to mention that the Iraqi women and girls have been the most struck and the most vulnerable and have suffered the most from this deterioration. On the other hand, Iraq is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the Arab region. We've heard from colleagues how vulnerable it is anyway, but in Iraq, it's one of the most vulnerable. And within Iraq, southern Iraq is most exposed area of the country to climate change. So we've seen over the last few years decreased rainfall, rising temperatures, severe sandstorms, drought, shortages of water, etc. If we zoom a little bit on the marshlands or the marshes, women, I have to say, are the beating heart of the marshes, and they have been most severely affected by climate impact. They are the breeders. They are the ones who provide the water, not only for these households, but also for buffaloes, who are the most important livestock in the region. For me, this is one of the most interesting quotes, I have to say, from our project with one of the women partners that we have, where she says, our livelihood depends on buffalo breeding, from which we sell milk and dairy products. What's interesting is, she said, droughts affect humans and animals alike. So for the marshlands, it's a continuation between climate change and between their living conditions, but also between how they get their livelihoods and their position in the community. So our response actually is to pilot two main initiatives in the marshes that looks at an integrated package to enhance women's participation and its leadership role. And here I was very happy actually to hear the regional director when she was saying the women are leading at the community level, and that's very, very important, but it's not always recognized. So our integrated package actually has several principles, including recognizing the role of women at the community level, their full participation in the governance structures at the community level, also valuing and recognizing their economic, social, and cultural benefits to the community. One other principle is to mainstream gender issues in all the activities that we are implementing, both in UNDP Iraq, but more specifically in the two initiatives that are directed at the marshlands, and adapting solutions to the local context based on a solid understanding and sensitivity of the local cultural, but also local gender roles. So our Climate Nexus project in the marshlands addresses two main issues. It looks at innovative solutions for clean water and wastewater management, looking also at off-grid solar, PV systems, etc., and livelihood diversification through an entry point that we have selected as ecotourism, in order to increase household income while protecting the ecosystem services. So how are we focusing within this project on women? We are focusing on decreasing the everyday burden that woman has in the marshlands. We're tailoring our livelihoods interventions to actually based on a local understanding and a local cultural norms in the region to target livelihoods interventions that would be uptaken and adapted for women through environmentally and socially responsible ecotourism. But we're also working with our partner, Dr. Jassim, and with the Governor's Office, but also with the ministry to strengthen the public policies that really look at the socioeconomic integration of youth and women. Maybe one last piece of information. UNDP Iraq has been undertaking a series of policy briefs on the impact of COVID-19 and the crash in oil prices on different sectors in Iraq. We've published one on fragility, another one on social protection, another one on social cohesion and macroeconomic policies. Our latest one, and I invite everyone here to look at it, it's on our website, looks at the impact of COVID on environmental sustainability in Iraq. And two of the most important findings is that, as we've heard from other colleagues also, COVID-19 has exacerbated affected the issues by conflict, lack of public sector governance reforms, etc., on Iraq, and has had an impact on increasing Iraq's environmental fragility. And in all of this, we've seen that women continue to be disproportionately affected by environmental degradation. And we have several policy recommendations for our partners and donors, but also our governmental partners, two of which zoom in on the importance of mainstreaming environmental sustainability and recovery initiatives to ensure a green recovery, and to include women in decision-making, planning, and implementation for enhancing community resilience. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over the 5 minutes. And thank you very much, Dr. Jassim, for giving us the time also to join UNDP in this webinar. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zena, for this my favorite subject, really, and this is a very nice presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think I should speak in Arabic, my official, because it's an official meeting, so it's an obligatory. So, السيدات والسادة الأكارم، السيدات والسادة المشاركين في فعالية اليوم العالمي للمرأة، تغير المناخ والأمن البشري ودور المرأة القيادي في المنطقة العربية. السيدة خالدة بوزار، المديرة الإقليمية لمكتب برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي للدول العربية، وأهنئها بمناسبة بدء مهام عملها في هذا المكتب. دكتورة زينة، الممثل مقيم لبرنامج الإنمائي المتحدة في العراق. السيدات والسادة الأكارم المشاركين في هذه الفاعلية، أهنئكم بمناسبة يوم المرأة العالمي. وبالتأكيد هذه الندوة هذا اللقاء في هذا التوقيت المهم هو رسالة مهمة جدا لمناقشة ما تعانيه المرأة خصوصا في هذه المنطقة. وبالتأكيد نلتقي اليوم في ظل تحديات حقيقية تواجه كافة القطاعات البيئية والسياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية والصحية في المنطقة، وتعتبر النساء أكثر المتأثرات وأكثر الفئات هشاشة أمام التحديات مثل تأثيرات التغيرات المناخية وجائحة كورونا. وبالتأكيد أكثر فئات المجتمع هشاشة تجاه تلك التحديات، خصوصا في المجتمعات الريفية، حيث أن المرأة يقع على عاتقها مسؤولية مزدوجة كونها متأثرة من هذه التحديات، وكذلك هي جزء مهم من الحلول التي تقدمها لمجابهة هذه التحديات والصعوبات، خصوصا وأن تأثير التغيرات المناخية أصبح لها تأثيرات اقتصادية واجتماعية وأمنية مهمة، كانتشار ظاهرة لاجئ المناخ في المجتمعات العربية نتيجة تأثير التغيرات المناخية من جهة، بالإضافة إلى الجفاف والتصحر وشحة المياه، وهذا كان سبب مهم لزيادة الأعباء على المرأة في مجتمعاتنا. إن العراق من خلال القطاع البيئي وضع سياسات واستراتيجيات بيئية مهمة تهدف إلى التنوع الاقتصادي ورسم خرائط طريق نحو المزيد من استخدامات الطاقة المتجددة والآليات النظيفة والتكيف مع تأثيرات التغيرات المناخية. وكل هذه السياسات والاستراتيجيات أخذت بنظر الاعتبار المشاركة الحقيقية والفعلية للمرأة من خلال دورها المهم في إعداد التعافي وبناء مجتمعات مرنة مقاومة، وصولا إلى بيئة مستدامة تركز على صحة البيئة وتعزيز الانتقال إلى الاقتصاد الأخضر، وبالتأكيد يكون بالتوازي مع دعم أولويات أخرى مثل تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة ودعم الشباب ومكافحة الفقر. إن وزارة الصحة والبيئة في جمهورية العراق عملت بشكل دؤوب على أن يكون للمرأة دور حقيقي في تنفيذ المشاريع البيئية وإعداد الاستراتيجيات والخطط والبرامج الحكومية الوطنية التي تؤسس إلى زيادة استخدام الطاقات المتجددة والحد من انبعاث الغازات الدفيئة، ويوطن استخدام ونقل التكنولوجيا الحديثة وزيادة مرونة القطاعات المتأثرة، حيث كانت المرأة في الكثير منها هي قائد حقيقي ومهم في تنفيذ كل هذا. أتقدم بالامتنان والشكر الجزيل لبرنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي لدعمه المتواصل للوزارة في كافة القطاعات وخصوصا في قطاع المرأة، ونتقدم بالتهنئة لكافة النساء العاملات في برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي بهذه المناسبة، ونتقدم بالتهنئة لجميع السيدات والسادة المشاركين، وأتمنى لهم النجاح، خصوصا للسيدة خالدة بوزار المديرة الإقليمية في مهامها بمناسبة استلام هذه المهام. وكذلك أتقدم بالامتنان لكل مكتب البرنامج الإنمائي المتحدة في العراق لجهودهم الكبيرة في دعم الحكومة العراقية في إقرار ووضع سياسات وبرامج تحاول التخفيف من تأثير التغيرات المناخية على الفئات الهشة خصوصا المرأة الريفية. وبالتأكيد نأمل استمرار هذا التعاون المثمر بين الوزارة وبين البرنامج في جميع المجالات ذات العلاقة من أجل تمكين المرأة وإشراكها. وأؤكد بأن المرأة دور كبير على مستوى وزارتنا، أكثر من 50% من منتسبي هذه الوزارة هم من النساء، وبالتأكيد يحتلون مواقع قيادية. وأتشرف بأن هنالك 3 وزارات في حكومة السيد الكاظمي رئيس الوزراء، وهذا بالتأكيد يعطي انطباع كبير على الدور الكبير الذي توليه الحكومة العراقية للمرأة، وبالتأكيد نحتاج إلى المزيد من إقحام المرأة في تحمل المسؤولية. شكرا جزيلا لحضراتكم، وأتمنى لهذا اللقاء أن يثمر عن نتائج حقيقية. شكرا جزيلا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Thank you, Dr. I can't resist, however, reminding you that the commitments under CEDAW are for 30% representation of women in government. So I hope one day we will see that also in Iraq. But thank you very much for your commitments and for that very interesting presentation on what's happening in Iraq. And now we will just move to another country in the region for a slightly different example, from Sudan, to my colleague Desi Kyorcheva, who will tell us something about a different example of a region that is suffering from climate change, and Sudan's experience of women and climate security in the context of stabilization programs. Over to you, Desi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances and colleagues, and everyone. Happy International Women's Day from Sudan. I am sharing my screen. I hope you're already able to see it. I'm hoping that to make you part a little bit of the colors of Sudan and the work that we have been doing with the colleagues here on specifically in regards to the stabilization effort over the last several years. A lot of the challenges for the Arab region of other countries across the region are shared by Sudan, so I would not go in details across all of them, given that they've been covered, but I would really like to draw your attention to some Sudan-specific challenges, which especially in the last 2 years, in addition to COVID, have changed dramatically the way we work and operate, and are going to change it even more for the future, more notably Sudan's revolution from 2018.
Desi, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we cannot see your screen.
Oh, sorry for that. Let me try again. Yeah. No, thank you for the interruption.
Thank you. That's better. Thank you very much.
Can you see it now?
Yes. I hope everyone else can see it. Thank you.
Start the slideshow. I don't know why. Okay. Yes. So the challenges that Sudan is facing, as I was saying earlier, are not very different than the ones faced by other countries across the Arab region. We have increased desertification. Sudan is very severely affected by climate change. And here it's really important to say also that more than half of the population of Sudan relies on agriculture. So as such, extreme weather events, flooding and drought are very, very dramatically affecting more than half of the population of Sudan. What I was saying also earlier is that the current political transition that's taking place in Sudan, it has a very, very importantly affected our work. And also the Juba Peace Agreement that was signed in October last year stipulates very clearly how important the access to natural resources and their accessibility by different ethnic religious groups is very important to the peace process. Another thing I would like to draw your attention to is the lack of data-driven policies about at the community, state and federal level, as well as the impact that conflict in the southern states and even across the border, which more recently is the example also of the Tigray crisis, are not only driving further and fueling displacement, mass displacement, but also disrupts traditional pastoralist roads, which create additional tensions across communities. In terms of stabilization effort in Sudan, we have a programming that's running across currently 68 communities across 7 states. And it's something that it provides a very important structure and a backbone for a series of other interventions, not only for peace building and governance, but also in addressing the results of displacement, climate, but also providing solid basis for climate action that I'm going to touch a little bit later. Our stabilization approach relies essentially on establishment of community-based bodies whose capacity are built and developed over time. And these bodies are called community management committees, are composed by different groups of the community, but the different groups present in the community. So if we have a large population of refugees or IDPs concentrated there, they are part of these bodies and decision-making processes. In this logic, the stabilization efforts allows for specific women committees that are pushed forward by the communities through UNDP as intermediary and direct link to governance structures. This is something that we have been doing for quite a few years already, but is becoming even more important in the last year when the transitional government in Sudan is placing higher emphasis on inclusion of women at different level of governance structures across the country. Another thing I would really like to point out here is that these bodies not only allow for women's inclusion in governance processes in Sudan, but also to their socioeconomic empowerment, which in turn really supports the breaking of taboos around women's involvement, but also allow for women to discover new roles that they can play in their communities in regards to monitoring of depletion of natural resources, security, and then early warning and conflict, early warning for disaster and resource depletion, but also conflict resolution. Being conscious of time, I'm gonna just, without going into details, I would really like to illustrate this as with two examples. One is example of the past, but also as we are currently renewing the project under different framework also in the future. We did use our stabilization program structure to test a global pilot in 2016-2018 under women's peace and security. And that was a global pilot we implemented jointly with UN Women and UN Environment, which focuses essentially on strengthening women's roles in decision-making over natural, conflict resolution, decision-making over natural resource management. And I'm very happy to share the final report and the materials related to this project for those who are interested. But some of the major conclusions that we have found under this project is that natural resources are a very strong entry point for women's empowerment in peace building. More specifically, this is given the cultural, ethnic, and tribal traditions in Sudan. This is a space which women, both in pastoralist and sedentary communities, occupy very actively, and is a space which is less acceptable on behalf of men for women to occupy. As such, their inclusion in governance bodies through that vector has become easier than in other dimensions, and also very naturally linked to conflict resolution. Another big conclusion from that project was that climate resilient livelihoods and sustainable natural resource management are key opportunity for women's socioeconomic empowerment. And again, more specifically with promoting climate resilient livelihoods and new agricultural practices for climate change adaptation. Another really important conclusion that the three agencies working on this project share is that women's impact on conflict prevention in sustaining peace and environmental action exceeded the expectations that we have. And in addition to resolving conflicts that arise between sedentary and pastoralist communities in certain areas, they have been playing major role in other dimensions of climate action. Just an example that comes to my mind now is, for example, issues related to plastic pollution, where the space and the platform given by community bodies through the program has been allowing women to be informed on effects of of plastic pollution that has on the cattle, the environment, and themselves. And as a result, we have discovered completely by chance that entire nomadic pastoralist tribes and nomadic groups have decided among themselves to stop using plastic, which is something that we really did not see coming. This program is just about to be revived under Peace Building Fund in a different location in Sudan with the same partnership between the three agencies, more specifically in the Blue Nile state, which is very central to implementation of peace agreement and ongoing processes. So we are very much looking forward to that. Another initiative that we're having, and which is again capitalizing on stabilization efforts that we have already been conducting for several years, is a pilot on climate security with support from the Crisis Bureau and the Climate Security Mechanism, which is taking place in Kassala State. It is important to flag that we chose this location prior to the Tigray conflict. And we are happy that we did, because this would provide a very important lessons for us to integrate into wider stabilization programming, more specifically related to links between human security, displacement, and degradation of natural resources, competition over resources, and climate change adaptation in that area. Important again to flag that we have in the same region substantial in further growing programming related to answering effect and stabilizing communities affected by displacement as a result of Tigray crisis, but also protracted displacement in these eastern states, as well as programming related to prevention of violent extremism and community stabilization. Under this pilot project, and again using similar models that have worked at community level, we are working towards establishing women committees and build capacity of communities and local governance at different level to develop new methodologies for monitoring, early warning, awareness raising, disaster risk reduction, and data-driven policy that would allow for development and adaptation of national action plan for environmental action, but also that would factor effects of socio-economic crisis currently taking place in Sudan, which, as is the case in many other countries, just being further exacerbated by COVID, and in our case, by the effects of displacement in the region. As part of some of the interventions that we're planning here, but also that we are planning under wider stabilization, is very central the access to renewable energies, specifically in regards to the response of displacement during the Tigray crisis. UNDP had stepped further in supporting humanitarian actors in immediate emergency response by providing access to healthcare and renewable energy solutions. And it's a solution that we have tested and that's been very, very successful in a situation where we're seeing displacement as a result of conflict, resulting ultimately in accelerated degradation of natural resources, which in this case, we are mitigating with the provision of renewable energy alternatives, more specifically cooking solar stoves in refugee camps and host community, which are slowing down the cut of the forests for firewood, among others. I think I can definitely continue to talk much more. I'm aware of the time and I only have 10 minutes, but I'm very happy to share additional information and answer any questions that come here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Desi, for that fascinating illumination of things on the ground in Sudan. And actually, I'd like to thank you very much for really in a way answering one of the questions, or many of the questions that have already been asked. We have a group of questions around the relationship between women and climate and social cohesion and the Women, Peace and Security resolutions, especially resolution 1325. And I think you highlighted very clearly the fact that women are doing the peace building on the ground. And there's been a tendency over the years to think about 1325 at the, and peace building at the top level, but the reality is what's happening at the grassroots level. And I think Desi, you really showed that very clearly, and where that connection between peace building and climate change is very much that role of women on the ground, as it were. So I'm going to think in a way that question has been answered. Oh, sorry, Desi, you want to say something?
Sorry, there is some delay. I was just asking if you can allow me to elaborate this and take it a step further, because what we have witnessed in our programming is that not only that women are doing this at the community level, but this also, in fact, environmental action becomes a peace building exercise. And particularly we have seen this in this joint programming where in this joint program that we had with UNEP and UN Women, colleagues from UNEP were using our community established bodies to test a community environmental action plan at the time for the first time. And what we have seen is that, in fact, specifically women, but also overall pastoralists and sedentary communities gathering together to work on the assessment of the environmental action plan actually allowed them to resolve differences. And it did become a peace building exercise in itself, which is a link that we not always bring further. So thank you for noting that. Okay.
Thank you. But there was also a general question about whether women are well represented on the bodies that negotiate climate change, and how well women are represented across the board in some of this area. And I wondered if Heba Al-Hariri would be, I know she answered some of it online, but whether she'd like to make a comment about that in general to the benefit of everybody who's here. If I may hand over to you, Heba.
Yes, thank you. Just speaking about maybe my area of expertise related to water diplomacy, I think there are several efforts that have been taken around the region to advocate on the importance of the role of women in water diplomacy in general. And recently, the Arab Water Council also was part of a regional report, particularly speaking about women and water diplomacy and the role that women can play in the negotiations. Although this is still currently the representation of women in negotiations are still also lacking behind, and we still need to advocate and enhance the participation of women, not only on the top levels, but also through the whole process, to be engaged in the different levels of negotiations. As well. So I believe the work that we are doing under the Gender Equality and Women Empowerment Group particularly focus on the importance of participation in decision making. And I was just referring Dr. Yusuf to the work of their group, and because he also was talking not only about the gender representation, but also about the participation of CSOs and the different entities in this process, which we think is very important, and they also need to be a main part of the decision-making process. So this is from what was mentioned from my side in Arabic to Dr. Yusuf.
Thank you very much. There's also a question to Iraq, which I'm going to kindly ask my colleague Rania to read out in Arabic, seeing as my attempt to speak Arabic earlier led to lots of confusion. So I apologize. Go ahead, Rania.
مرحبا. السؤال هو ما هو مدى الاهتمام الرسمي بقضايا البيئة وتأثيرها على أوضاع المرأة في العراق، وكذلك مدى تضمين اتفاقيات التعاون التنموي بين العراق والمنظمات الدولية لهذه القضية، وهل هناك منظومات إحصائية تساعد على المتابعة والتقييم؟ والسؤال من السيد أحمد، سوري لك أريد أن أرى الاسم بالكامل، أحمد عبد النبي. تفضلوا البانلست.
دكتور جاسم بتحب تجاوب؟ دكتور جاسم
أنا بعدك دائما
دايما بتخجلنا يا دكتور. بالحقيقة في اهتمام رسمي كبير جدا في العراق في I'm hearing my echoes. هناك اهتمام
لا المشكلة
هناك اهتمام كبير جدا في المنظومات الإحصائية في العراق. بالحقيقة بنشوف هالشيء مثلا بالناشونال، ما لازم أحكي إنجليزي وعربي، بالتقارير والخطط الوطنية حول التغير المناخي، وأيضا الخطط الوطنية العامة. ونرى هذا التطور إذا فيني أقول بآخر كم سنة بالمنشورات الإحصائية اللي عم بتم وضعها من وزارة التخطيط ومن غير الوزارات كمان، حيث يتم وضع
published by Ministry of Planning.
الإحصاءات التي يتم وضعها في التداول. مثلا هلأ العراق عم يعمل على استراتيجية وطنية للتعافي، ودور المرأة والإحصاءات المتعلقة بالمرأة أساسية جدا. نحن لنا الشرف ببرنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي أنه نكون عم نقدم المساعدة التقنية للمؤسسات الحكومية، بس حتى بدون لوبينج من برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي أن هذا الأمر هو أساسي بالنسبة للإحصائيات الوطنية والخطط الوطنية التي تضعها الوزارات المختلفة. بس بترك لدكتور جاسم يمكن لحتى يفصل أكثر. تفضل دكتور.
شكرا جزيلا. بالتأكيد هذا موضوع مهم جدا، وتعلمون حضراتكم بأنه احنا لدينا وزارة سيادية مهمة جدا هي المسؤولة عن وضع الخطط والبرامج الوطنية والاستراتيجيات، هي وزارة التخطيط والتعاون الإنمائي. هنالك جهاز مختص هو الجهاز المركزي للإحصاء. الفيدباك من كل الوزارات العراقية تذهب إلى الجهاز المركزي للإحصاء ويصدر تقرير سنوي بكل الفعاليات، وبالتأكيد مشاركة المرأة ومساهماتها والفعاليات والأنشطة كلها تذكر في هذه التقارير. على مستوى وزارتنا بالتأكيد نحن نعمل بمحورين. المحور الأول هو محور المساهمات الحكومية الفعلية في تشجيع مساهمة المرأة العراقية في الكثير من الفعاليات، وبالتأكيد يمكن لأول مرة الحكومة العراقية تدعم منذ سنوات قليلة مشاركة منظمات المجتمع المدني التي أصبحت فاعلة جدا في صناعة القرار، بل وأصبحت فاعلة جدا في الاشتراك في تنفيذ الكثير من الخطط التنموية. وبالتأكيد الكثير من هذه المنظمات قياداتها نسوية، بل وأكثر منتسبيها نسويين. وزارتنا كذلك تقوم بمشاريع وأنشطة خصوصا لدعم صمود المرأة خصوصا في المناطق الريفية، سواء كانت هذه المشاريع في المناطق الريفية أو بالتعاون مع المنظمات الدولية أو بالتعاون مع الحكومات المحلية. أنا أؤكد على أن هنالك لدينا حقيقة قاعدة بيانات، أصبحت لدينا قاعدة بيانات ممتازة على مستوى الوزارة، لدينا قاعدة بيانات ممتازة جدا بالأنشطة والفعاليات على مستوى الحكومة المركزية. هنالك تقرير وطني يصدر سنويا يتضمن جميع الفعاليات والأنشطة. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Dr. Jassim. That's very clear. Thank you both for answering the question. We have a few minutes left and we have a couple of people who would like to ask questions live. So I will allow them to do that, but I would ask that they are very short, please. So first of all, if I could hand over to Dr. Arif Al-Haj. If someone can help him speak, please.
Dr. Al-Haj, you can unmute and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, if that's not going to work, however, then
Hello.
Hello. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah. What we noticed, what we observe in Arabic regime, they are preparing action plan of 30-25 for women without women. There is no much civil society engaged in preparing such policy. Second issue also, we found we are talking about the climate change and hello, excuse me.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Shall I go ahead to talk?
Yeah, quickly.
Yeah, quickly. What I want to see, I want to say we should shift the discussion about 30-25 as a lead discussion into the ground, to invest in the grassroots, in empowering the women in the ground, in the rural area, because of your consider the climate change without considering the poverty, how to make the balance. Poor people, poor family, poor women, they have no choice except to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think your point is very well made.
Money.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, I think that's exactly what we're trying to get across in. It's exactly what we're trying to get across in this webinar is exactly that women are playing leaderships on the ground in dealing with climate change and in such a way are contributing to peace. So thank you. I'd also like to offer the floor to Dr. Soukaina from the Center for Arab Women's Training and Research in Tunisia, who is with us and has a very pertinent question about green climate funds, I believe.
Thank you, Frances. Hello, everyone. You heard me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I cannot start without welcoming our Director of Regional Bureau, Dr. Khalida Bouzar. And I am so happy that we have one expert from the green world. I have two questions. The first one is about the link between all the SDGs 13 and others with the climate change and all the Arab country reports that they didn't report a lot on gender. And we in Qatar have a report on what they report on gender, and it's a very, very few. And I think that we have to encourage and to, I cannot say to train, but to push to gender and women NGOs and others partners to have more know-how to integrate gender issues in the SDGs report. Because sometimes, as we did before with Beijing and other CEDAW and so on, we don't know how to integrate gender. It's not because we don't want, it's because we don't have the know-how. And it's not the Ministry of Women who are in our countries, they are not the responsible on the SDG report. You understand the point is that the ministries and the structure who are in charge of these SDGs report are not, number one, the women's entities and structure. And for that, there was a lot of gap. It's my first questions. It's more suggestion than
yes, Soukaina, we're running out of time. If you have a very quick question.
The second one is very short because we know that there was some mobilization fund for the green fund. I want to know where they are, these dollars and these billions, and what they committed themselves, the countries. We need to have some information about the disbursement, if there was some, for women, for gender, for Arab countries, for poor countries. It's just my question.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody who posed interesting questions in the question and answer. We will attempt to get back to you, and we will share all the presentations with those who registered for this webinar. I would like to hand over to my colleague Kishan Khode, who's the head of the climate and energy team in the Regional Bureau, who I hope will be able to answer Sukaina's question on where does the money go in the region on the Green Climate Fund, and help to wrap up our session today. Kishan, over to you. Thank you.
Merci, and congrats to everybody. Really an excellent discussion today, I found. And so thanks and congrats to the organizers, to our partners at AWC, our local partners in Iraq, etc. Special shout out to Francis and Sujala, Rania, and others. I think it was an excellent discussion. I guess a key takeaway in terms of a brief conclusion that I'll provide for today's event is that, of course, as we've heard throughout the discussion, climate change isn't gender neutral, and therefore climate action shouldn't be gender neutral either. So I thought we had some great examples of the issue of the challenge and some solutions that are underway in the region. Men and women, households, communities face different effects based on their level of vulnerability, preparation, resilience to climate hazards. One's livelihood, socioeconomic status, geographic location, gender can all affect vulnerability to climate change. So it's paramount, of course, that countries globally and of course in the region understand these impacts from a gender responsive perspective that considers women's roles, responsibilities, capacities to actually be part of scaling up climate action. So as we heard today, that's why under our SDG Climate Facility regional program, which is a joint UN program with many UN agencies, with regional partners like LAS, AWC, and others, we are working closely with countries and regional partners to undertake gender analyses and really try to mainstream gender responsive actions as part of local climate action. These analyses and capacity development actions can improve understanding of differentiated gender impacts of climate change, identify key gender and climate actors, assess climate and gender policy and strategies at the local level. And this can really provide a foundation for countries to explore the gender dimensions in their national and sectoral climate action and strategies. So a few very brief takeaways. Number one, consolidating and further enhancing the nexus between climate action and gender equality helps us to understand the gender impacts of climate change, right, in very specific contexts, as we heard today in the great examples from Iraq and Sudan. So very localized contextual factors to help us understand this nexus between climate and gender. Number two, this process really helps identify key actors and capacities in the country. So who are the leaders in the country on gender and on climate that can work together? How can we put together new institutional responses as well? Number three, this process helps to assess the policies and strategies. So gender responsive climate action is also linked, of course, to national climate strategy and policies, which is very much in focus this year in particular on the road to the climate COP 26. So what I last few words, I guess I would like to say is that, as this year we go towards COP 26 and really trying to look at greater ambition on climate action, the gender action plan, which Dr. Khalida mentioned in the opening, is really important, and it's something we take really strongly to try to mainstream gender into this goal of scaled up climate action. And that leads a little bit to the last question by one of the audience. We have about 80 projects in the region with the support of numerous global funds, Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Least Developed Country Fund, the Adaptation Fund, even the Multilateral Fund for Montreal Protocol. So various global funds, about 5 that we mobilize resources for our country partners through these numerous projects. About 80 projects, about $500 million of grants that UNDP implements across the Arab region for enhancing action on climate change, water, biodiversity, and various other priorities. On GCF specifically, we have initiatives underway in Egypt, Sudan, new ones coming up in places like Somalia, Djibouti. We have a very important GCF readiness programming in places like Iraq and other countries in the region as well. So the role of UNDP as part of the Green Climate Fund is really to mobilize resources, those resources for our local partners. And so
كمصادر وكموارد لشركائنا، فهناك منحة ب أعتقد قال مئات الآلاف من أجل مساعدة الدول.
Latin America, etc. And this is primarily focused on our role, our programming with Green Climate Fund's support is primarily focused on climate adaptation. And a lot of those initiatives, including the ones in the Arab region I just mentioned, have this quite strong dimension on the nexus to human security, displacement, women's empowerment, poverty reduction. So in all of our programming, we really try to advance climate action with co-benefits across priority SDGs like poverty, gender, water, and peace. But we'll be happy to share more information on any and all of that. But I'll stop there. I thought it was a great discussion, and thanks again to everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to working with all of you to really make progress and implement greater measures to make this nexus between climate and gender a reality in the region. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kishan, and thank you everybody for being with us and joining this very interesting discussion. And thank you particularly Dr. Jassim and Heba for being with us throughout the period. Thank you indeed. And I hope this collaboration on women, human security and climate change will carry on to the benefit of all. Thank you very much. Happy International Women's Day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Heba. سديت الكاميرا لسه